For 10,000 years, warning beacons drifted silently along the outer edge of the solar system. They weren't satellites. They weren't space stations. They were enormous slabs of black metal, wider than mountains and taller than the tallest skyscrapers ever built. Somehow, they remained perfectly motionless in the vacuum of space, anchored by technology so ancient that not a single engineer in the known galaxy could explain how it worked. Every surface was carved with deep inscriptions written in more than 400 known languages. Some belonged to civilizations that had vanished thousands of years ago. Others came from species that had chosen silence long before recorded history. Yet every inscription carried exactly the same warning. Do not enter this system. Do not disturb the world that lies within. Do not awaken what sleeps here. Turn back. Leave. And never return. Commander Kaler of the Galactic Dominion stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring through the massive viewport at the closest warning beacon. His long gray head tilted slightly as he studied the ancient monument. Then he spoke only 2 words. Move forward. The fleet obeyed immediately. 47 warships advanced past the warning markers and crossed the invisible boundary that had remained untouched for 10 millennia. Kaler wasn't reckless. Far from it. He had earned his command through decades of careful planning, flawless logistics, and successful military campaigns across the Dominion's outer sectors. He respected history. He simply didn't fear it. According to every historical record, this quarantine had been established near the end of an age so old that most citizens of the Dominion considered it mythology rather than actual history. To Kaler, that made the warnings meaningless. Whatever had terrified the beings who built those monuments was almost certainly gone. 10,000 years had passed. Empires had risen. Empires had collapsed. Entire species had gone extinct. The universe had moved on. His fleet was fully armed, staffed by experienced crews, and carried enough supplies to remain deployed for years. Their mission was straightforward. Survey the third planet. Locate valuable mineral deposits. Begin preliminary resource extraction for the Dominion's expanding infrastructure projects. Long-range scans had already indicated extraordinary mineral wealth hidden beneath the planet's surface. Kaler considered the quarantine nothing more than an outdated obstacle. And obstacles existed to be overcome. Standing several stations away, Chief Science Officer Dr. Lyra remained silent. She offered no objection when the order was given. Instead, she quietly returned to her console and reopened the classified archive connected to this star system. She had already read it twice that morning. Now she began reading it a third time. Line by line. Word by word. When she reached the final section, the one labeled Awakening Conditions, she paused. Her fingers rested motionless on the display. She closed her eyes for only a second before opening them again. There was nothing left to say. The decision had already been made. Moments later, the third planet appeared across the bridge's main display. Even Kaler found himself staring. It was beautiful. A world of deep blue oceans, emerald continents, and brilliant white cloud systems drifting peacefully beneath the light of its sun. From orbit, it looked fragile. Calm. Untouched. Exactly the kind of forgotten world perfect for a routine mining operation. Begin a standard orbital survey, Kaler ordered. The fleet's scanners swept across the planet. Within minutes, the results arrived. Rich mineral deposits. Multiple continents. Several untouched regions with enormous extraction potential. Kaler selected 3 isolated locations far from any visible population centers. Low-yield seismic pulse, he ordered. All 3 sites. The weapons fired. 3 controlled orbital strikes slammed into the surface with the force of moderate earthquakes. From orbit, the impacts seemed insignificant. Tiny flashes of light. Brief clouds of dust. Nothing more. But 10,000 kilometers away, on a quiet farm in Montana, a man named Jack Carter was standing outside his barn when the ground suddenly lurched beneath his boots. He stopped, looked down, then slowly raised his eyes toward the pale afternoon sky. Everything appeared normal. The wind hadn't changed. The clouds drifted peacefully overhead. Yet something about the tremor felt wrong. It hadn't rolled through the earth like a natural earthquake. It felt as if something enormous had pushed down from above. Jack narrowed his eyes and stared upward for nearly a minute. Finally, he shrugged, walked back inside, poured himself another cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and turned on the television. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Within 3 hours, seismic monitoring stations on 6 continents had detected the impacts. 5 hours later, military radar systems in 4 different nations identified dozens of unidentified objects holding high orbit around Earth. 8 hours after that, every major government on the planet knew they weren't alone. Emergency meetings began immediately. Secure phone lines lit up. Military commanders, scientists, presidents, prime ministers, generals. They all asked the same 2 questions. What is up there? And what are we going to do about it? There was one thing the Galactic Dominion had failed to include in Commander Kaler's mission briefing. Human beings had an extraordinary habit of putting aside their differences whenever a common threat appeared. Political arguments didn't disappear. Old rivalries didn't magically vanish. But suddenly, none of those problems seemed nearly as important. Less than 24 hours later, representatives from nations that hadn't cooperated in years were sitting around the same table, studying the same orbital images, sharing the same intelligence, preparing the same response. Meanwhile, Commander Kaler launched a standard reconnaissance probe toward the planet's surface. Its mission was simple: collect soil samples, analyze the atmosphere, evaluate local conditions. The probe landed in a broad grassy field surrounded by low hills. A small reconnaissance drone emerged from its compartment and immediately began scanning the area. Exactly 12 minutes later, a dusty pickup truck rolled across the field. Jack Carter climbed out. He looked at the strange machine sitting in the middle of his property, blinking quietly beneath the afternoon sun. Without the slightest hesitation, he walked straight toward it. The drone rotated to face him. Jack folded his arms across his chest. "I don't know who sent you," he said calmly. "But you've got 30 seconds to give me one really good reason why you're parked in my field." The drone froze. It had never been programmed for this situation. It understood hostility. It understood fleeing. It understood hiding. It did not understand a muddy-booted farmer calmly giving it an ultimatum like it was an unwanted trespasser. It simply stood there, processing, waiting. Jack waited too. When no answer came, he solved the problem himself. Jack Carter was a practical man. He counted to 30. The drone never answered. So he walked back to his truck, grabbed a handful of heavy-duty zip ties, returned to the strange machine, and secured it to a sturdy wooden fence post at the edge of his field. "If your boss comes looking for you," Jack muttered as he tightened the last tie, "they can knock on the front door like everybody else." Satisfied with his work, he climbed back into his pickup, drove home, poured himself another cup of coffee, and settled into his recliner just in time for the evening emergency broadcast. 2 hours later, a Galactic Dominion recovery team arrived at the landing site. They found their reconnaissance drone exactly where Jack had left it. Still operational. Still blinking. Still firmly zip-tied to a fence post. No one on the recovery team spoke during the entire retrieval. Back aboard the flagship, Commander Kaler received the incident report. He skimmed over it without much interest. Primitive locals. Unexpected behavior. Reconnaissance temporarily interrupted. Nothing worth delaying the mission. That evening, however, another message arrived. This one was different. Dr. Lyra accepted the transmission first. She spent several minutes translating it before quietly placing the finished document on Kaler's desk. She didn't say a word. Kaler picked it up. The message contained no insults. No emotional outbursts. No desperate pleas. No attempt to negotiate. It simply read: "You have 24 hours to explain your presence and your actions within our star system. This is a declaration, not a request. We will be waiting for your response." Kaler read the message twice. Then he gave a dismissive snort. "They're making demands?" He tossed the document onto his desk. "They're a pre-spaceflight civilization. They don't have orbital weapons. They don't even have spacecraft. I'll deal with them when it's convenient." Across the bridge, Dr. Lyra lowered her eyes. She had expected exactly that response. What Kaler didn't know was that Lyra had read the complete archive. Not just the mission summary. Not just the operational briefing. The entire classified historical record. There was information buried inside those ancient files that had never been included in the official mission overview. Information that changed everything. Far away. Deep beneath the oldest government complex in the Galactic Dominion's capital. Inside a vault that hadn't been opened in 12,000 years. Something awakened. An ancient artificial intelligence slowly emerged from dormancy. It wasn't connected to the modern Dominion. It predated the Dominion itself. Its only responsibility was to monitor one thing. The quarantine. Its sensors detected an unauthorized fleet crossing the restricted boundary. Verification began immediately. Coordinates confirmed. Historical records accessed. Protocol initiated. A message was automatically transmitted to Commander Kaler's private command console. The notification appeared silently. No alarms. No flashing lights. Just a single line. "Commander. You have made a grave mistake. We regret what is about to happen to your fleet." Kaler never saw it. Not that night. The next morning, Earth was already changing. Kaler spent the first 6 hours of his day reviewing mining reports, approving logistics requests, and sending a lengthy progress update back to the Dominion Senate. His report was optimistic. The quarantine system had been entered without resistance. The third planet had been surveyed successfully. Mineral reserves exceeded expectations. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Only after finishing his paperwork did he finally notice the unopened notification waiting on his console. He frowned. Opened it. Read it once. Then read it again. "We regret what is about to happen to your fleet." He leaned back in his chair. For a long moment he simply stared at the ceiling. Then he shook his head. An obsolete automated system. Nothing more. It doesn't understand context. The galaxy has changed. The danger it's warning about probably disappeared thousands of years ago. He closed the message. Deleted it from his active display. And returned to work. When Kaler stepped onto the bridge later that morning, Dr. Lyra was already waiting. Not impatiently. Not nervously. Just waiting. He had worked beside her long enough to recognize that particular silence. It meant she believed something important needed to be said. But she wouldn't say it unless he asked. "What is it?" Kaler finally said. "I think you should read the complete archive. I already read the mission summary." "I'm not referring to the summary." She met his eyes. "I'm referring to the entire archive. It tells a very different story. Kaler folded his arms. The summary contains everything operationally relevant. It doesn't. Her answer came quietly. Without emotion. Without challenge. Just certainty. If you're planning any further operations on the planet, I strongly recommend reading every page. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Kaler sighed. Send it to my console. I'll read it later. Lyra obeyed immediately. The file transferred. He thanked her. Then never opened it. Not that day. But elsewhere. Someone else did. At nearly the same moment Kaler ignored the archive. The Dominion Senate received two separate reports. The first was Kaler's mission update. The second was the automated alert generated by the ancient quarantine AI. Most officials dismissed the warning. One person didn't. A young intelligence analyst named Sarah Brooks noticed the contradiction between the two reports. She wasn't especially experienced. She wasn't politically important. But she possessed something many senior officials had lost years earlier. Curiosity. Instead of ignoring the alert, she retrieved the complete quarantine archive, made herself a cup of tea, and started reading. 3 hours later, she finished the final page. She sat perfectly still. Then quietly stood up, picked up the printed report, and walked straight to the office of the Dominion's chief archivist. His name was Rowan. She placed the thick stack of papers on his desk without saying a word. Rowan looked up, saw her expression, opened the file. Read the first 2 pages. His face immediately changed. Without grabbing his ceremonial robes. Without calling an assistant. Without saying goodbye. He hurried directly toward the Senate chamber. An emergency session was called within the hour. And for the first time in thousands of years, the oldest history in the galaxy was finally about to be read aloud. The emergency Senate session was anything but calm. Younger senators dismissed the quarantine as ancient superstition. The warnings are 12,000 years old. They're historical relics. Commander Kaler commands one of the strongest fleets in Dominion history. There is nothing on that primitive world capable of threatening 47 warships. Their voices echoed through the chamber. The older senators remained silent. Many of them had devoted centuries to studying the earliest records of galactic civilization. They remembered history that most citizens considered nothing more than legend. They didn't interrupt. They simply waited. Eventually, the arguments died down. The room fell quiet. Only then did the oldest senator present rise to his feet. His name was Elder Senator Thorne. He rarely spoke during public sessions. When he did, everyone listened. The elderly statesman folded his hands together and looked around the chamber. Perhaps, he said softly, before deciding what Commander Kaler should do next, we should first understand what this archive is actually telling us. No one interrupted. The chamber became perfectly silent. Then Thorne began reading. 12,000 years ago. The third planet inside the quarantine zone was not a forgotten primitive world. It was one of the galaxy's great civilizations. Long before the Dominion existed. Long before its predecessor empire had reached the stars. Humanity was already exploring them. They built faster-than-light vessels. Established trade routes. Founded colonies. Formed alliances across dozens of systems. Their influence expanded steadily for centuries. And during that expansion, they fought 3 interstellar wars. Each time, humanity was the smaller power. Each enemy possessed larger fleets, older civilizations, superior resources, and vastly more military experience. Yet every war ended exactly the same way. The opposing civilization eventually sued for peace. Not humanity. Their enemies. The archive described the pattern repeatedly. Humanity paid an enormous price in every conflict. Millions died. Entire worlds burned. But eventually, they always prevailed. When peace was finally requested, humans accepted. They rebuilt what had been destroyed. Then they simply went home. The old sovereignty of Ket became fascinated by this pattern. Their greatest military analysts studied every campaign in extraordinary detail. They searched for the secret behind humanity's victories. Their simulations considered every possibility. Superior technology. Greater intelligence. Hidden advantages. Numerical deception. Exceptional strategy. Again. And again. The computers produced the same conclusion. None of those explanations were correct. The true answer was disturbingly simple. Humans did not quit. Every military civilization in the galaxy possessed a breaking point. A level of casualties, losses, or suffering, where continuing the war became irrational. Every strategic doctrine relied upon this assumption. Inflict enough damage, and eventually the enemy would surrender. That was how wars ended. Humans never followed that calculation. When they suffered losses, they rebuilt. When a strategy failed, they adapted immediately. When they were pushed to the edge, they didn't collapse. They became more determined, more creative, more dangerous. Every prediction model eventually failed. Because every model assumed humanity would eventually reach its breaking point. It never happened. Finally, the sovereignty of Ket decided to eliminate humanity before they grew even stronger. They launched the largest military campaign in their history. The objective was simple. Strike quickly. Overwhelm humanity. End the threat forever. The war lasted 400 years. It ended when the sovereignty of Ket requested peace. Not because humanity had conquered every world they owned. Not because their fleets had been completely destroyed. They asked for peace because they were exhausted. Completely. Utterly. Civilization ally exhausted. After 4 centuries of continuous war, the Ket Empire could fight no longer. Humanity still could. In fact, according to every surviving record, their soldiers had become even better than when the war began. The peace negotiations were unlike anything recorded before. Historians expected humanity to demand reparations, territory, political concessions. Instead, humans proposed something no one anticipated. They would leave. Voluntarily. They agreed to dismantle their interstellar civilization. Deactivate their advanced technology. Allow future generations to gradually forget the wider galaxy. Accept a planetary quarantine. Withdraw from galactic affairs entirely. In exchange, they requested only one thing. Leave us alone. The sovereignty of Ket accepted immediately. Several historians later suggested an unusual explanation. Humanity had not accepted because they were defeated, or exhausted, or afraid. They accepted because they were bored. The war no longer challenged them. It had become repetitive. They wanted something else. Elder Senator Thorne stopped reading. He looked around the silent chamber. Then turned one final page. This, he said quietly, is the part everyone should remember. He read the final paragraph aloud. The technological regression. The memory suppression. The quarantine. Were never intended to be permanent. They were designed as a long sleep. And the original treaty specified only one condition under which humanity would awaken. He paused. The room felt colder. Then he finished reading. An act of external aggression against humanity's homeworld. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence stretched across the chamber. Finally, Sarah Brooks, still standing quietly near the rear wall, spoke for the first time. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The orbital bombardment. She swallowed. Already happened. No one answered. Because everyone in the room understood exactly what those words meant. Thousands of light years away. On Earth. Dr. Emily Parker woke abruptly at 3 o'clock in the morning. She had been dreaming. An incredibly vivid dream. But as consciousness returned, the details vanished. Only one overwhelming feeling remained. She sat upright in bed. Something felt different. She couldn't explain why. Without thinking, she climbed out of bed, walked into her home office, grabbed a marker, and began writing across the whiteboard covering one wall. She never stopped. Equation after equation. Diagram after diagram. Formula after formula. Hours passed unnoticed. When the morning sun finally rose, the board was completely full. Emily stepped back. Her hands trembled slightly. She recognized pieces of what she'd written. Physics. Engineering. Mathematics. All familiar. Yet the complete design was unlike anything she'd ever studied. Unlike anything humanity had ever built. She stared at it for several long minutes. Then reached for her phone. A former colleague answered sleepily. Emily? I need you to come over. Right now. Is everything okay? Emily looked back at the impossible equations covering her wall. I don't know. She spoke quietly. But I think something just woke up inside me. She wasn't the only one. Across the planet. Scientists. Engineers. Mechanics. Teachers. Students. Factory workers. Ordinary people everywhere. Began waking from strangely vivid dreams. Each one carried the same feeling. Fragments of knowledge. Forgotten memories. Ideas they had never learned. Yet somehow already knew. Something ancient, long buried inside humanity, was beginning to open its eyes. 6 months after the first orbital strike, Earth was almost unrecognizable. Not because cities had been destroyed. Not because civilization had collapsed. Everything still looked the same. The highways were still there. The skylines hadn't changed. The rivers still flowed exactly where they always had. But something fundamental had shifted. There was a sense of purpose that hadn't existed before. It was as if billions of people had suddenly fixed their eyes on the same distant horizon. Every morning, Dr. Lyra found herself standing before the observation window aboard the Dominion flagship. It wasn't part of her routine. It had simply become a habit. She would sip a cup of hot tea while watching the blue and green world below. At the same time, she monitored the latest long-range scans. Every day, something new appeared. Construction projects had sprung up across dozens of continents. Power production had increased dramatically in only a few months. Entire industrial zones had expanded at impossible speed. Massive reinforced structures were appearing in remote deserts, frozen tundras, and isolated coastlines. The Dominion's pattern recognition software couldn't identify them. Their shapes resembled launch facilities. But that made no sense. She compiled the data and presented it to Commander Kaler. He reviewed the scans for less than a minute. Industrial expansion, he said dismissively. They're still a pre-contact civilization. They don't know spaceflight. Whatever they're building isn't a threat to a fleet in high orbit. Lyra nodded politely, collected her tablet, and quietly returned to her station. She said nothing else. Instead, she began keeping a private record of everything she observed. She couldn't explain why. Only that something deep inside her insisted those observations would matter later. What was happening on Earth was both simpler and far more extraordinary than anyone in the Dominion could have imagined. It wasn't the work of one government, or one laboratory, or one brilliant scientist. It was everyone. Ordinary people woke up every morning carrying knowledge they had never possessed the night before. A factory technician in Detroit spent his lunch break sketching an energy conversion system so advanced that no one on Earth had ever imagined it. A college student in California filled 6 notebooks with equations she had never been taught. When professors reviewed her work, every calculation proved correct. A retired aerospace engineer in Alaska woke from an unusually vivid dream and immediately began designing composite armor capable of surviving direct plasma impacts. He had never studied materials science. Yet every blueprint worked. The phenomenon spread across the globe, faster each week. What had been buried inside humanity for 12,000 years wasn't returning gradually. It was erupting. Like water exploding through a dam that had finally broken. Knowledge flooded back into the human mind with unstoppable force. The Unified Emergency Council had remained in continuous session since the orbital bombardment. Every day brought another impossible report. New discoveries. New inventions. New breakthroughs. Eventually, the Council made a simple decision. Trying to control innovation from the top down was impossible. Instead, they built an open system. Anyone with a useful idea could submit it. The best proposals immediately received funding. Scientists, engineers, tradespeople, programmers, mechanics, military veterans, even farmers, worked side by side. Resources were allocated based on results. Not rank. Not titles. Not politics. The system was messy. Arguments were constant. But progress became almost impossible to stop. 2 weeks after the council formed, the alien reconnaissance drone Jack Carter had zip-tied to his fence post arrived at a government research facility. Teams from 6 different countries began taking it apart. Engineers, electricians, aircraft mechanics, materials specialists, computer scientists, even agricultural equipment technicians. Everyone contributed something. 11 weeks later, they understood every major component. Within 4 months, human engineers had built a working version of the drone's propulsion system using materials found entirely on Earth. Their first prototype exploded. The second wasn't much better. The third barely functioned. The fourth worked. By the 5th month, humanity had successfully replicated alien shield technology. By the 6th, they had developed weapons capable of challenging Dominion ships. The atmosphere inside research facilities changed. Panic disappeared. Determination replaced it. Commander Kaler remained unaware of just how much Earth had accomplished. Although the Senate had begun urging caution, he still believed humanity needed a demonstration of Dominion superiority. He selected several communications satellites in high orbit. Destroy them. It'll remind them of the difference between a planetary civilization and a galactic empire. The strike was precise. Controlled. Measured. 3 civilian maintenance technicians died instantly. The satellites disappeared in bright flashes of light. Kaler considered the operation a success. 4 hours later, Earth answered. The message contained no threats. No emotional language. No dramatic speeches. It simply identified the names of the 3 people who had been killed. Then came one final statement. Your actions constitute an act of war against humanity. Effective immediately, the Unified Emergency Council recognizes a formal state of armed conflict with the Galactic Dominion. Nothing else. No demands. No negotiations. No insults. Only silence. Dr. Lyra read the message 3 separate times. The calmness frightened her more than any declaration of vengeance ever could. There was no anger. No fear. Just quiet certainty. A line had been crossed. And somewhere beyond that line, humanity had already begun moving. That night, Dr. Lyra made a decision. Sarah Brooks had spent 4 years working as an intelligence archivist. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't anyone history was supposed to remember. She was simply meticulous. Careful. The kind of person who trusted old records more than confident opinions. For 6 months she had watched every warning inside the ancient archive come true. Every prediction. Every caution. Every consequence. Commander Kaler ignored them all. She couldn't. That evening she packed a small backpack. Left a brief note explaining her decision. Entered an emergency escape pod. And launched herself toward Earth. Only after the engines ignited did she realize there was no turning back. The descent was violent. The capsule shook so hard she could barely breathe. She spent the entire journey gripping the safety harness, wondering whether she had just made the last decision of her life. The pod slammed into a frozen lava field. When Sarah finally regained consciousness, she looked through the cracked viewport. Gray skies. Snow. Jagged black rock. A handful of bundled-up humans surrounded the capsule. They weren't pointing weapons. They looked curious. One of them opened the hatch. Another wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders. Someone handed her a steaming cup filled with something that smelled unfamiliar, but wonderfully comforting. Coffee. They led her to a modest government building nearby. Inside, a single man waited beside a simple wooden table. He stood as she entered. Smiled politely. My name is Ambassador James Walker. He gestured toward the empty chair. Before we begin, is there anything you need? No threats. No interrogation lights. No intimidation. He simply waited. Patiently. That somehow made Sarah even more nervous. She told him everything. The quarantine archive. The Senate session. The awakening condition. Commander Kaler. The Dominion fleet. Finally, she revealed the part she believed mattered most. This isn't their full military. Walker remained silent. She continued. What Kaler commands is only an exploration fleet. She hesitated. The Dominion possesses more than 4,000 warships. She expected fear. Shock. Urgency. Instead, James Walker nodded thoughtfully. That's useful to know. He folded his hands on the table. We were worried this might end too quickly. Sarah stared at him. She searched his face for panic. Found none. Only quiet confidence. For the first time since leaving the Dominion, she wondered if she had defected to the winning side. 3 weeks later, humanity launched its first true warship. It hadn't started life as one. Originally, it was an aging cargo hauler. A massive, box-shaped freighter that had spent decades hauling industrial equipment between ports around the world. Now, almost nothing about it was original. Its hull had been stripped down to the frame. Engineers reinforced it with newly developed composite armor. 6 oversized railguns were welded onto its exterior at angles that would have given any professional naval architect a heart attack. The new faster-than-light drive barely fit inside the engine compartment. Several engineers insisted it never should have worked. It did anyway. The finished ship looked exactly like what it was. Something built at impossible speed. By people who cared far more about whether it worked than whether it looked good. Its crew numbered 11 volunteers. Former military officers. Engineers. Mechanics. Pilots. And one Montana farmer. Jack Carter. Ever since he had zip-tied an alien drone to a fence post, the media had turned him into an unexpected national hero. When officials asked whether he'd like to join humanity's first deep space crew, his answer had been immediate. Sure. Then he'd gone home. Fed his horses. Packed a duffel bag. And reported for launch. There was one final debate before departure. The crew wanted to name the ship. Government officials preferred something dignified. Professional. Historic. The crew disagreed. Late one evening they climbed onto the hull with industrial paint and enormous brushes. By sunrise, bright white letters stretched across both sides of the ship. The stubborn bastard. The Unified Emergency Council formally objected. The crew listened respectfully. Then unanimously voted to keep the name. The stubborn bastard launched beneath a crystal-clear morning sky. Within hours, it reached the outer regions of the solar system. 2 Dominion patrol cruisers guarded the edge of the quarantine zone. Their sensors immediately detected the approaching vessel. Primitive construction. Improvised weapon systems. Single ship. Minimal threat. The patrol commander chuckled as he sent a brief report to Commander Kaler. 1 human vessel intercepted. Engaging. The battle lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, both Dominion cruisers were drifting powerless through space. Weapons destroyed. Engines disabled. Life support failing. The stubborn bastard wasn't untouched. Its starboard side had taken heavy damage. 1 railgun had been completely destroyed. Several compartments had lost pressure. But every crew member survived. Jack Carter had spent most of the battle operating one of the targeting systems. Afterward, he transmitted a short message back to Earth. Within hours it had spread across every news network on the planet. That's 2. Tell them to send more. Aboard the Dominion flagship, Commander Kaler stared silently at the battle report. He read it once. Then again. Finally, he stood. Walked to his private quarters. Sat before his terminal. And at long last, opened the archive Dr. Lyra had sent him weeks earlier. This time, he read every word. From beginning to end. Hours passed. When he finally reached the last page, he didn't move. Outside his window, Earth turned peacefully beneath the stars. Blue. Green. Beautiful. He finally understood. The warning monuments. The quarantine. The silence surrounding this system for 10,000 years. No one had ignored those warnings because no one had been foolish enough to test them. Except him. For the first time in his career, Commander Kaler realized he had absolutely no idea what to do next. 2 years passed. Humanity never stopped building. Neither did the Dominion. Eventually, the Senate reached its decision. Despite repeated objections from Elder Senator Thorne, despite every historical warning, despite the quarantine archive, they voted for war. The younger senators believed numbers would settle the matter. No civilization, no matter how determined, could survive overwhelming force. The Dominion assembled the largest armada it had fielded in nearly 3,000 years. 4,200 warships. Supply vessels stretched for thousands of miles behind the battle line. Repair ships. Hospital ships. Troop transports. Everything required for a decisive campaign. Military analysts examined the numbers. Ran simulations. Calculated probabilities. Every model produced the same conclusion. The war would be over quickly. Then, humanity arrived. Long-range sensors counted the approaching fleet. Once. Twice. 3 times. The result never changed. 600 ships. Only 600. Several Dominion officers assumed the scanners were malfunctioning. Others believed the humans must be preparing some kind of diversion. Surely, no rational civilization would willingly challenge 4,200 warships with only 600 of its own. Yet the human fleet kept advancing. Straight toward them. No hesitation. No attempt to retreat. No hidden reinforcements. Just 600 ships. And absolute confidence. The first clash occurred near a distant belt of rock and ice at the far edge of the solar system. History would later remember it as the Battle of White Line Ridge. No one expected what followed. Certainly not the Dominion. The battle lasted 11 days. During the opening 48 hours, the Dominion's overwhelming numerical advantage was obvious. Human ships exploded across the battlefield. Entire formations disappeared. Several of humanity's largest cruisers were destroyed. Dominion commanders smiled. Everything was unfolding exactly as their tactical models predicted. According to every simulation, humanity would reach its casualty threshold by the 3rd day. Retreat on the 4th. Surrender shortly afterward. Day 3 arrived. Humanity didn't retreat. Instead, they reorganized. That was the moment Dominion officers began feeling something unfamiliar. Unease. Whenever a human formation was shattered, the surviving ships didn't scatter in confusion. They immediately formed entirely new task groups. Selected new targets. Adapted their tactics. And attacked again. When human command ships were destroyed, the surrounding fleet didn't collapse. No hesitation. No paralysis. No panic. Operations continued almost seamlessly. The Dominion had built its military around centralized command. Humanity had built theirs expecting command ships to die. They had planned for disaster before the battle even began. And that changed everything.